The session is going to be moderated by Hopkins, who's operations manager at Keystone Accountability. Keystone's mission is to improve the effectiveness of social purpose organizations. They develop better ways of planning, measuring, and reporting social change. And they have a focus on constituency voice. So they help organizations listen more closely to the people who they're supposed to be helping. Kai has an MBA in charity management, and he's worked in the nonprofit sector for 7 years. Before working at Keystone, he worked at Alliance Magazine as their general editor, a leading publication on international philanthropy and social change. So with that, I would invite Kai to take it away.
Thank you, Genevieve. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, welcome to this session on listening and feedback loops. Now, before I introduce you to our panel, I'd like to start by conducting a little bit of feedback. So very quickly, could you please raise your hands if you are convinced about the value added of feedback loops? Okay, about half maybe, I guess. And once again, can you raise your hands if you conduct or engage in feedback loops?
I think so.
Okay, so a little less than half, So there's some of you out there who are convinced but don't do it. So let's see what changes over the course of this session. Now let me waste no further time and introduce you to our panelists. We're very lucky to have 5 people with us today, so it's going to be quite busy, but hopefully we'll have a diverse and interesting discussion. So starting at the far end, we have Michael. Michael is the Chief Development Officer of Digital Divide Data. He helped start it in Cambodia 12 years ago. DDD enables youth from poor families access professional employment in its social enterprise, performing digital work while they complete higher education. Next to Michael, we have Ximena. Ximena joined Bamboo Finance in 2010, where she heads the company's impact planning and improvement efforts throughout the investment's life cycle. This includes screening pipeline companies against Bamboo Finance's social impact criteria, defining with companies a social impact framework, collecting data, and reporting to investors. Well, and investees, maybe we'll find that out later. That's interesting. Okay, then we have Cristina. Cristina has been working at FINAE since 2008 and is currently in charge of the Investor Relations Department and for the measuring and reporting of financial and social metrics. FINAE is a social impact financial institution created by a group of Mexican entrepreneurs in order to help support low-income Mexican students access quality private university. Then we have Margaret Kuhlow. Margaret leads a team of technical professionals who analyze the local development impact, US economic effect, environmental and social impact at OPIC. And last but not least, we have Jessica, who is head of knowledge management at Villgro. Jessica has been working in India, in Latin America and the US for 15 years as an academic and practitioner, mainly focusing on institutional design for converting cash into social impact. So we're very lucky to have a wide range of views, and I think we'll have a worthwhile and fruitful discussion. So we're here to discuss listening and feedback. And as was alluded to in the opening of today, this can be quite a complex ecosystem to understand. It can include both data about your own performance as an organization, but also the performance of your investees. And also, moving around this ecosystem, we have beneficiaries, we have clients, we have funders, we have a number of different actors who can all influence and affect what happens. So I think this morning we're going to try and unpick a little bit of that. Now, before we get into the main part of the discussion, there's just 3 broad issues I'd like to highlight. The first is that feedback is challenging. As was discussed this morning, there's issues around it at every stage, every step of the process. From the beginning with how you collect your data, who do you collect your data from, what do you ask them? To the middle part, how do you make sense of it, how do you analyze the data? And also to the end, how do you use the data for improvement, how do you use it to actions? Now, hopefully what our discussion will show is that although there are challenges, these are speed bumps, they're not brick walls, they're things that can be overcome. And I think we can learn from other sectors. For example, the customer satisfaction world has been doing a lot of this for a lot longer. And I think there are lessons to draw there, and I think some of our discussions will look at that. The second thing, and very much linked to that, is that feedback by itself is not actually that helpful. feedback to be useful needs to be understood, it needs to be analysed, it needs to be made sense of. Also, it needs to land into an organisation in an appropriate way. So it needs to come into management scorecards, it needs to be discussed at meetings, and only then can you actually take value from the data you've collected. So sometimes benchmarking can help, or cross-time comparisons, or linking it with other data points that you may cover. But it's all about performance management, and hopefully I think that will come out in our discussion this morning. Now the last thing to touch on, and it's already been talked about a little today, is the system level. And I think that's something that over the next 2 days you'll explore a lot more of, but I think we'll touch upon that today as well. And it really raises more questions than it asks. And we need to think a bit about what are the tools that need to happen at a system level, or as Jed Emerson noted, maybe the mid-level, so slightly beneath that. Maybe there's several levels we can talk about. So I think we'll look at these issues not only this morning, but also over the next couple of days. But let's start very much at the beginning. Let's start with a few of the practicalities and very much an introduction to our panelists. Perhaps I can start with you, Ximena, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your data collection and who you collect your data from.
Does this need to be activated by myself, or?
I think they're hooking you up now.
Sounds scared. Is it okay now?
You may need to speak.
What am I supposed to do?
I have a handheld for you.
Okay. Thank you.
I think so.
Okay. Do I have the opportunity to quickly present Bamboo, or should I just jump into the...
Within the context of
Okay.
who you collect your data from, I think.
Okay, I think it might be useful to provide some background and explain. Bamboo Finance is a private equity company. We invest in SGBs that have a product or a service that contributes to low-income communities, that serves a basic need. And we currently have 2 funds, one's entirely dedicated to financial inclusion, and the other one is in access to finance, access to education, to healthcare, etc. FINAE is actually one of our investees. So to the question, I think it's important also to say that we take minorities shares in the company, so we do have a seat or 2 in the companies, and that provides an insider also perspective, of course, of the company. So who we collect data from, basically we are trying, I mean, I was really thrilled to come to this conference because I feel that in this room there's a lot of knowledge on how to do this and how to do this better. And ultimately that's what we are trying to do. I can't pretend that we have figured this out yet. What we do is we collect information directly from our investees on a quarterly basis. We have, of course, as a private equity company and with investors behind us or above us, the obligation to provide financial and non-financial information to investors on a quarterly basis. We also decided last year to launch, and I have it here with me, I actually have 1 hard copy, but it's on the website. It's our impact report, in which we have made, I would say, a first thorough effort to present which companies we are invested in, what these companies are doing, how much we invested, what year we invested. So there's a lot of disclosure of information there. We also have selected a number of indicators we're tracking for each one of the companies, and these are outreach indicators or output. And we do, on every company, describe what the impact, ultimate impact of that company we believe to be. So to your question, sorry, I'm circulating a bit. Yes, the primary source of information for us is directly our investees, who provide us information based on the metrics we have agreed with them. So we initially just sit down with the company and describe. To give an example, FINAE is giving loans to students from low and lower middle income segments of the population. So we discussed with Cristina what is it that makes sense to track here, and very much in line with what Harold was saying earlier. But there's tons of things you would want to know about your end clients and beneficiaries, what makes sense and what is operationally relevant, and what will ultimately give you information about how well you're doing it or not. So yes, those are the metrics we are currently following, for instance, in FINAE, a number of students by gender, by universities, but maybe I'm talking to what you're going to talk. Maybe I should take another company.
And very quickly then, as well as your investees, do you also engage with ultimate beneficiaries in your data collection?
We do, but not to the rigor and with the frequency and that we want. So that's part of what me coming here is I want to learn to do this better. So when I'm in the field, of course, we're definitely interviewing clients. As I mentioned, one of our funds is in microfinance, so we have currently 32 institutions in that fund. And when investment managers who sit on boards are visit the companies, they also sometimes, but not every time, visit end clients. So yes, that does happen to a certain extent. But I think that understanding what technology, for instance, is there that could help us do this better is one of the things I want to take away from this conference.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe coming to you, Jessica. So Ximena talked about mainly focusing on their investees, but also trying now to move more into beneficiary feedback. So how does that resonate to you in terms of looking at investees and beneficiaries?
Sure. So just a quick, I think mine's working. Yeah, so just a little bit of quick information about Villgro. So we're a business incubator, and we work with really two groups of very early stage people who want to become small and growing businesses with social impact is sort of one way to look at it. With one group, we give grants, investment, mentoring, and basically work on building a early stage business into a larger business with a broader geographical impact. Another group we work with are people who have an idea and are building a business around it, people who have an invention and are building a business to deploy it. So in a lot of cases, the type of feedback that we collect and that we can collect are, on one level, is feedback about us as a service provider. Is the mentorship we're providing good? Is there a good match between the networking opportunities that we give our entrepreneurs and what the entrepreneurs really need? We run a fellowship program that places people who are kind of early career to mid-career professionals outside of the social sector in these businesses. Do they like the fellows? So we have a lot of sort of an ongoing, and it's still very informal. One of my jobs is to figure out a way to formalize that without irritating all of my colleagues, which is an ongoing process. So that's one type of beneficiary feedback. The second is for the businesses that actually are in the revenue stage, that actually are deploying their inventions. We work with them to help with their customer analytics if that's their primary means of impact, to help manage their HR if they're one of the businesses that's really focusing on employing disadvantaged populations. That's something that internally we locate that within the incubation team, not so much the knowledge management team. And that's a way to try to keep us honest about not imposing too much of a burden. We don't go to, right now, we don't go to the end beneficiary. For those businesses that do right now have end beneficiaries. We have once in a while when we have the funding to do it, but we don't have kind of regular and ongoing funding to do that. For the idea stage businesses, there are no end beneficiaries yet. And so what we're trying to do is take an informed call about, sorry, I have something in my throat. Well, about the likelihood that they will have impact. So with that, we go to people who are experts in the field to say, if it's a healthcare technology, to doctors who are working in rural hospitals, things like that, who are not beneficiaries, but a sort of distributed expertise.
Okay, interesting. So once again, your work with beneficiaries is quite minimal, ultimate beneficiaries. Now, Michael, how about if we come to you? So are your data providers, are they beneficiaries then that you get your feedback from?
Sure, they are. Let me just give a brief introduction to digital divide data. We're a hybrid social enterprise, and our mission as an organization is to create opportunities for young people to access higher incomes. and better life opportunities. And we do that through both direct employment of these beneficiaries and also supporting them through higher education. And so the employment is actually in a business where we offer a whole set of business process outsourcing services to libraries and archives, telecom companies, publishers, and other clients. As a network of operating companies in Cambodia, in Laos, and in Kenya, we really have an advantage in that we're directly employing our beneficiaries. And so we have an employee database, and we've recently updated our employee database, and it's in line with many of the IRIS metrics. And so we know, for example, where they come from, whether they come from a rural or an urban area, how many young women we employ, how many young people with disabilities who we employ. And so we're able to track that directly. And those are really the inputs and to some extent the outputs, how many people we have employed, for example, in our different operating centers. The piece that we've added in the last few years is to look at how we do a better job of tracking the outcomes of our work. And the most important thing is to look at how have we helped these young people to increase their incomes. And so each year we do a survey of all of the people who work within our organization, as well as the young people who we call our graduates or alumni, who've left our organization and have found jobs or started businesses outside. We work with a third-party provider to collect that data. Initially, we started having them actually do interviews with a large set of questions, and we've evolved now to just starting to collect this data through a computer-based survey.
I think it's a very interesting point that you feel you're in a strong position because you can identify and contact your beneficiaries, and I think that's something that all organisations struggle with to an extent. So I can see how you're smiling about that one. Yes. Okay, thanks. Now, so Margaret, why don't you briefly introduce a little bit about your data collection? You know, what are you looking for, and how do you get it?
Sure. First couple sentences on OPIC. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation is the U.S. government's development finance institution. So we're a U.S. government corporation. We have a joint public-private board. Our portfolio is quite big and quite diverse. We have about $16.5 billion in about 103 countries across three main products: political risk insurance, investment guarantees, and direct loans. And our portfolio is diverse in a number of ways that are really important for data gathering. So we've got very small clients, we've got very large, sophisticated clients, we've got clients in different countries dealing with different problems. We're everywhere from small political risk insurance in Haiti to large structured finance in a variety of countries. We're in Pakistan, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Uruguay, we're in Brazil, we're in Malaysia. Finding a way to collect data that gives us a standard way to report to our funders is actually quite a challenge. So we have a standardized set of indicators of data that we collect. We do obviously financial reporting on a quarterly basis, like most funders would request financial reporting on a quarterly basis. We also, on an annual basis, do a collection of development-related indicators, and that's a combination of things that are numbers that you can measure, like the number of employees you have, to things that we put a number on that aren't actually quantities you can measure, like putting a value on, for example, whether or not there's a new product, whether or not we believe there's demonstration effect from the investment, how far something has reached either into rural areas or to new customers who haven't been served before. But we gather that information both on the front end to collect projections of what our clients project they're going to do against all those metrics, and then we actually collect that every single year and then monitor how they're doing against what they had projected. And we, like some of the others, do checking in the field to make sure that the standardized reporting that we're getting back is the same as what is actually happening on the ground, and we get some more color around the numbers that come in.
Okay, good. So just a quick follow-up there, maybe. How do you know what to look for, or what to ask? So when you're trying to get feedback from people, one of the hard things is obviously making sure you're asking the right questions. So how do you approach that?
So our data collection mechanism is an online survey. Actually has to run through a formal U.S. government approval process, goes through the Federal Register, there's public comment, it's reviewed by several agencies, so it's really hard for us to change that. We have a standardized set of metrics. We just did a revision of that over the last year, 2 years, which involved going to all of our our sister agencies. So we talked to all of the other DFIs. We looked at what the other agencies are doing, what the private sector is doing in this field. So we looked at GEARS, which actually is very similar to our own metric. We looked at, we tried to use IRIS nomenclature whenever we had indicators that IRIS also includes. I think our biggest challenge is there are things that we are required to report. So those we have to collect, whether or not they're important data points for our clients. And I think all of us struggle with those things that are maybe more important to us than they are to our clients, and trying to actually extract that information in a quality way. I think those are the really the hardest ones.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And it is a very hard thing to do. Now, Cristina, let's come to you, and perhaps you can also introduce a little bit about the work that you do and what your data sources are. But then perhaps you could tell me how you make sense of the data. So you have this feedback coming in. How do you analyze it? How do you say, okay, this is what they're telling us?
Okay, hi. Briefly, can you hear me?
No.
Like this? Can you hear me? Okay, more or less. Sorry. Okay. So, well, as Kai and Ximena were telling you, FINAE is a social impact financial institution that provides student loans mainly to low-income Mexican students who cannot have access to tertiary education. So just to give you an idea, there are 11 million youngsters that have the age to attend college, but they cannot do it. Only 2.4 approximately are already enrolled in a university. So the other 7 million are left without higher education. That would be equivalent to say that almost the entire population of Chicago is left without a tertiary education, or Switzerland's population. So it's a pretty big number. They cannot attend public universities because in Mexico, public universities are already saturated and they reject most of the applications. And so that's where FINAE comes to help fill in that gap. You know? So regarding the data collection, we collected, there are 2 moments. The first one is at the very beginning when the student comes and fills in their loan application. We collect we ask for many information that helps us later to get some very valuable information. For example, their socioeconomic level, the level of schooling of the head of the household, which, just to give you an idea, 25% of our clients' parents did not complete elementary school. So 70% or almost 70% of our students are the first member in their families to pursue a higher education. So there's a lot to be measured. And the second moment comes when we conduct surveys to our students, the ones who have already graduated or the ones that are still studying. So they answer our surveys. We try to get to know where are they now, how was their situation at the very beginning, financially or economically, what are they doing now, and we, in a short future, I hope we can really have that comparison to see if they've have a social
Progression?
Progression, change their socioeconomic level. That would be very, very valuable, but we're still growing. We don't have yet, not so many years have passed in order to be able to measure that.
And then just Thank you, but going back to my question then, the second half of it anyway, how do you make sense of this data as it comes in? So do you compare it to any other data, or do you, I mean, you're obviously interested in looking at cross-time comparisons, but how else do you analyze or make sense of what you receive?
Well, we are currently using the GEARS standardization, and there's a lot that what we get from the applications our students fill in. There are a lot of indicators that are iris indicators, and well, we also triangulate. Is that what you say? We triangulate. There are many studies from the OECD, FINAE, or other statistics institutions that help us be aligned and to be sure that what we're getting from the data is correct. For example, the numbers I just told you that about the level of schooling of the parents of the students, or that, for example, maybe in the future we'll be able to measure this, but 74%, well, the salaries of a person with a degree is 74% higher than a person's with only high school. You know? And those like hard data, we are being able to align with those and to say, oh well, yes, what we're getting is it's in accordance to that.
Yes, I see. So you're triangulating the feedback data, which is maybe more perspective data, with some hard facts from elsewhere. Okay, interesting. Well, maybe it makes sense then to come to Ximena next, because you work closely with FINAE or have some relationship. And from your point of view, which is one step further back, I guess, how do you make sense of what's coming in? How do you interpret the data that you receive?
What we feel is we have told our investors that they are investing in funds that contribute to low-income communities, right? So that's what we are to be held accountable to that. So that for us is a basic data point that we need to understand. I mean, how many of the FINAE students, to continue with the FINAE example, are in this category? So we had some discussions with Cristina. How do we, I mean, low income here, low income there, you need to have a standard and define what you're going to consider low income, right? And have some comfort, and then define, this is our proxy, this is the number we're using. Either you're taking international poverty lines or you're taking Mexico guidelines, but then do not change that assumption through time, right? So I think that's something that we feel currently very comfortable with, in the sense that the information being sent to us, I would say by many of our investee companies, we have, again, I adopted ourselves iris indicators. We have discussed with them. It has helped us to standardize and to understand if we call this a semi-urban or peri-urban or whatever. This is how we define it, and we're not going to change this along the investment life cycle unless there's evidence that needs to be readjusted, right? And then to receive that information and be able to communicate it further. I think that not only our obligation towards our investors, which is of course fundamental, and I've said that, but I think that to the larger public, and that's where for instance, reporting, issuing an impact report last year for us was important, in the sense that we felt now we have defined impact maps for our investee companies. There are 46 investee companies in our portfolio, so it's quite broad. We have reached a certain level of comfort. I wouldn't say, again, that we're totally comfortable, and in some cases it's been much more difficult. I hope all of the companies were FINAE type, but some do change assumptions on the way, or readjust data they had provided to you in the last quarter. And you need to be able to explain that, right? To explain those differences to the general public, and to all of us. But I think that ultimately, in the question of this session, it's about creating the feedback loops and making sure that, yes, you're serving the communities you said you're serving. yes or no that the sign of that product is convenient to the customer. And there, the FINAE has an interesting example that maybe Cristina can come back to in a moment. But also learning what perhaps what you didn't expect from your theory of change. I think that's also for us very important. Of course, also testing that, almost conducting sort of social audits. And I was 2 weeks ago in Honduras looking at one of our investment companies there, and I went to the field and interviewed a number of clients, and then I felt all of the clients I interviewed did not know what the interest rate they were paying was. And so what do I do with that information? Of course, I go back to the loan officer, I say, come on, why wasn't any client able to say what the interest rate is? And they say, well, it's because people are not used to it, they prefer to have the definition of the loan in terms of how much I need to pay every month, and that's true, but then you need to test that, to make sure that the loan officer is also not intentionally hiding the interest rate. Are you educating your client about how much he or she is paying? Because that's one of your obligations. And interesting enough, I was there to help this company apply for the Smart Certification campaign. And that's something that I told him. They're going to interview some clients. The clients don't know the interest rate. I mean, one thing is how well they understand that notion, and that's something that the loan officer should also help them understand. Even if at the end of the day what the client wants to know is how much he needs to pay every month, they should still be educated about what the interest rate is and then what the competitors' interest rates are. So on that feedback, yes, you ask your loan officer, why is this not the case? And then, of course, you go to the head office and you make sure that the persons in charge and are aware first that the clients aren't being apparently well informed, but also that the loan officer does dismiss the problem in a way, and you tackle this with them. But I think that as a private equity investor, we tend to see all of our relationships as partnerships. I mean, I'm not out there to check and control as a third-party auditor would do, or of course, if something comes to my attention which deserves some sort of immediate action, and I will do that as well, right? But I think that we have to help them develop, jointly come to a level where all of us feel comfortable with the practices. And
I would absolutely agree, and perhaps I can just take that point and maybe put it to you, Jessica. So in terms of engaging with investees or people who are giving you feedback, I mean, how involved are they in the process? Do they feel that they want to give feedback? Are they, in terms of communications, is it part of an ongoing dialogue? Are they engaged? And how do you approach that? How do you approach those issues with your organization?
Well, in the sense of our beneficiaries as an incubator, so the companies that we're working with, they really want to give feedback, and they're quite vocal about feedback, because ultimately the benefits that they get from us depend on how good we are at providing mentors and fellows and the terms of the grant and so on. So we get a lot of feedback around the due diligence process. We get a lot of feedback at the time of the investment agreement. People will call up and say, you know, we're having this issue with the fellow. This is how we're working with the mentor. So we're finding that there's a lot of interest, and it's very much like client feedback. It's, you know, people telling us how we can provide a better service, especially since we're in expansion mode and people know that we're in expansion mode, and some of our donors have just renewed and we're looking at expanding the portfolio, that there's a real eagerness to give really pretty constructive feedback. And I think that's partly because we're small and we have a personal relationship with all of the investee companies and all of the people who are going through the earlier stage program. And so we do have that rapport. On the ultimate beneficiaries of the companies themselves, one of the big areas where we really focus on is when the beneficiary is not the customer. So for example, in like medical devices, so the company will sell an anemia testing kit to a primary health center, but ultimately, and so the primary health centers, we can observe whether more of these primary health centers continue to buy and to recommend the anemia testing kit, but we don't know whether the pregnant woman or the child or the working age person who's actually having an earlier and non-invasive diagnosis of anemia, whether it's even being used or whether that's coming up. So that's where we get the partnership with the company, because they want to know that in order to make the next sale, and they don't, they're not necessarily, that's kind of outside of the firefighting, and that's where we're trying to concentrate more of our efforts. But we generally have people, we have a demand for it right now, and especially the feedback part, because it's different than the auditing part of the social impact, and I think people see it as more of a partnership than it would be if we were coming in and saying, we're going to check on your claims. So that's helpful in a sense.
I think that's interesting, and in the work that we do, we often see organizations struggle to get feedback, and it often comes down to the fact that people don't think it's worth their while to give feedback. So I think if you can create the environment where people think, well, this will be listened to, and this will help us in the long run, then they're more willing to give it. But you'll be surprised, I think.
There's that. I also think it's sometimes we often get more negative feedback than positive feedback, because I think it's very satisfying to complain.
Yeah.
So we do have to work for the. So you're saying great things about your fellow. Could you maybe put that on the record there?
Yeah.
We get the complaints more often.
I'm sure people love to complain. It is true. Okay, so Michael, let's put this over to you then, in terms of engagement with your beneficiaries. And I guess at some point there must come a time where you think we're asking them too much stuff. We're pestering them to fill out survey after survey. How do you get that balance between people wanting to give feedback and the other side, which is the costs to you as an organization in terms of time and money, but also the sense that we could be bothering them too much?
Sure. So, as Harold articulated earlier, and I don't know if Harold's still here, but I want to give a shout out to him, because he was one of our early supporters, as we were about 50 people in Cambodia, and now we're 500 there and working in other countries. But as Harold said, we've learned that we need to really focus on our business, and everything else falls out of running a successful business, and then we'll have the impact that we want to have. And so we've learned that just in terms of resources, we need to focus most of our resources in that. And we need to also do this kind of data collection and understand the metrics that we have in terms of our social impact. What we've just recently made this move from collecting data through in-person interviews to actually next week we will start collecting data using an online survey. And for us, we think that it will work quite well, because we train young people in using technology, and so they're all familiar with using computers, and they all have access. But we're going to see how it works. We did it in part because our scale has grown, and so we need to reach many more people, and there was a cost challenge. And with it, we also made some decisions that we just couldn't ask for as much information as we've had before, because in an online survey, we're not going to be able to ask the same number of questions as if we have a person who's captive and sitting down for 45 minutes or an hour to respond to questions. And so we've really needed to reduce the amount of information that we're collecting. So it's really important for us to collect that information, but we've got to look at how are we allocating resources that are appropriate to the value of that information for us, where we've got to be focusing on our sales, on our marketing, on our operations, in order to really have that impact.
Yeah, and I guess the technology piece is something which is changing all the time. So 10 years ago, it was very different, and I'm sure in 10 years' time it could be even more so. And I see in the program there are, if you're interested, I think in technology and collection, there are sessions on that over the next couple of days. So let me come back to another issue which has been touched on briefly, and it's an important one, I guess. It's reporting. So we've talked a little bit about why you collect data, and one of the reasons seems to be that you need to report to others about your own work and the work of your investees. So Margaret, perhaps we can come to you on this, because I understand that you report to Congress. So it would seem fitting while we're in DC to maybe ask you about that. And I guess linked to that, perhaps you could tell us what they're interested in. What data are they interested in? Do they appreciate the feedback data that you look at? Do they appreciate the other kind of hard numbers, or where's their interest?
The thing I'd love to say about reporting, which is obvious to all of us who work in reporting, but less obvious to people who don't touch it every day, you can't report on data you don't collect. I can't tell you how often we're asked to say, and what about this, and say it that way, and say it this way, and it's usually followed by, and please don't increase the burden on the clients of the things they have to tell you. And at some point, those things don't go together, right? So some of the things that Congress is most interested, the single thing that Congress is most interested from us is they want to make sure that the things that we're funding are not displacing U.S. jobs. They also like to know when the things that we're funding help U.S. jobs. So we have to ask all of our clients, grassroots business funds, Harold's actually quite a good client in this sense. We have to ask where you procure things from, because in as much as it's American, we can calculate back the US jobs impact. Well, not every client understands why in the world we're asking them where they're procuring from, because at the same time, we don't require them to procure from the United States. We're not tied. So it's trying to get them to collect that data and collect it in a form that we can use when it comes back is our single biggest challenge. And it's also the data point that Congress is most interested in. But they're also interested in how many people we're helping. So figuring out how you define a beneficiary and then how you count it through your various different kinds of projects is actually quite a big challenge. We do a very good job of collecting our job impacts, local job impacts. OPIC has been collecting for 40 years the local job creation impacts of the investments that we support. So we have really good experience in the kinds of ways you can ask the question to get a good answer and the kinds of ways you can ask the question to not get such a good answer, and how deep you can go into that question. So we've found, for example, that clients generally are able to tell us how many people they've added, what kinds of people they've added, so whether they're low-skilled, whether they're technical professional, whether they're managerial, whether they're male or female. And I think some donors shy away from collecting that level of gradation because they feel like it's really difficult, but that's the kind of stuff we found that actually clients have. As opposed to some of the things that are more complicated. So we have a good dialogue with our board first on the kinds of information we collect and how we hold ourselves accountable and our clients accountable to doing with our funds what we've asked them to do with our funds or what we've said we've allowed with our funds. And we have a good, I think, interaction with Congress about the kinds of data that we can report and the way we do our impact measure.
And just a quick follow-up then, I guess. Are Congress or other funders, are they interested in hard facts and figures, or, I mean, are we in our focus here on feedback data? Are we missing, for example, anecdotal data? Do they like a story? Do they like, Joe on the street and we've helped him, and do they respond to that? I
think it really depends on who, and you really have to have a sense for your audience, not just institutionally, but personality-wise. Some people take it, so everyone takes in information differently. Some people like to see pictures. Some people like to hear stories. I like to just see the equation. I can work the rest out. But not everybody likes that. So you have to be able to serve all of those different audiences. I think we've been trying at OPIC to get better at infographics because there's a big surge. People really like infographics, and you can see some. You get some really interesting information, really deep, and a lot out of relatively simple pictures, but that in itself is a science. Stories, people who are people like stories. They can take in your data better if you tell them what it's actually doing to a human being on the ground. So I think you have to have a good sense for who your individual audience is, and you have to be able to answer in whichever way you think is going to be the most effective, but understanding that you do need the rigor of the data behind for the people who do want to see the data and the rigor behind the data.
Okay, now maybe we should, I think we focused a little bit about on the pressures that we receive from funders, but what about the positive things that a funder can get you to do? So an open question to anyone, I guess, can you give me an example of when a funder has positively impacted on your ability to collect beneficiary or investee feedback? I'm not sure whether the silence means we're being too polite or whether we just don't know.
Okay.
Cristina.
I'll give you an example.
Please.
When FINAE's first product was completely different from what we offer today. And I'm sorry, yes, the example? You want?
Yes, an
Okay.
example, please,
Sorry.
yes.
So we weren't completely understanding what our clients, but specifically our parents' clients, wanted. For example, they would come to us and ask just one simple question: how much will I be paying monthly? And we would say, it's really, really simple. You will only be paying interest on outstanding balances. And they would just come like, okay, but how much will I be paying monthly? So what we discovered is that our target, well, the parents are not very familiarized with financial language or even the students. So we conducted that survey because the product wasn't selling the way we expected it would be. So we found out that they weren't understanding, they weren't getting what they needed. So that's why we completely changed the product. We created a new scheme, and we gave our clients what they needed. They came and said, yeah, so how much will I be paying? I mean pesos and cents. So that's why we changed the whole scheme. And we offer, well, today we offer a fixed university payment plan. So they know that from day one to the final day of their studies, they will be paying, for example, 2,000 pesos. That's it. They know, yes, they know the interest rate, but in Mexico there is this way of thinking that they think in cash flows. They do not want to know anything about interest rates. They do not understand. They need to know how much they will be paying with pesos and cents, because that's what they need to organize their income. So since then, well, it was a win-win equation. Our loan portfolio started growing incredibly rapidly, and our clients are satisfied, relieved, and they, now clearly understand our product and its benefits.
Excellent.
So I could just give a quick example.
Yeah.
The funders who've pushed us the most in this area have been the private sector funders. We've been fortunate to receive support from Boeing, from Cisco, from Microsoft, and when we've made proposals to them, they've asked us to articulate where we are in terms of our current metrics, what our goals are in terms of the metrics that we will achieve from their funding. And Boeing asks us to report annually. Cisco and Microsoft ask us to report quarterly based on how we're achieving the metrics based on the support that they've given. And it's forced us to redo how we collect data about our employees. We have this new employee database because we need that information on a quarterly basis. And we need to be better at how do we forecast how that information is going to change based on that investment.
So you feel that the funders and the external influence was a positive impact on your work there?
It's positive in that we now have much better data about it, and we're better able to predict it. I have to say it's been painful to go through that transition, and it's required a significant investment. And as I said earlier, we wrestle with the trade-offs of what are the investments that we make to measure the impact versus what are the investments in the business, and we put off making that investment for a while. I think ultimately it's going to be better for us as a business to internally have that data, and I think we're coming to that conversation.
Just I wanted to follow on that, because I think this investor pressure to report and to report more effectively is something that's just starting. It has not permeated necessarily in India. And it's just sort of starting to tighten now. I mean, with some of our donors, we're getting donors as an incubator, we're getting an increasing number of questionnaires about, okay, not just how many lives have you touched, which is actually a terrible indicator. It's completely meaningless, but it seems to be kind of the standard thing to do. So I think that the push is very helpful, and the push is very helpful for internal alignment across the team. To basically say, look, this is elevated to a matter of not quite a fire, but something that we really need to deal with now. But it works best, and it has worked best within Villgro and within our investee companies when there's some other money to take some time to think about how to set up a data generating and data management process that is self-renewing, that is low marginal cost, that may be a high upfront investment in exploring the technology, in customizing the technology, in setting up systems and training field agents to start to enter information from their interactions with customers. There's a high upfront cost, and if you push too hard with the stick approach and say incentives, 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 it pushes people toward sort of duct-taped and Band-Aid-like solutions that end up being fairly damaging to the organization and also end up generating really crappy data. Because you don't want to have to keep auditing and monitoring your data. You want to make sure that in some ways the system itself has some checks and balances. That, for example, the social impact relevant stuff is coming from operational data that if you wanted to fudge it, it would be really hard to fudge because it's embedded in the whole business and enterprise systems. And making those upfront investment is a skill that's really hard to find, the people who understand both the technology and the social side, and it's still pretty expensive, even in a market like India. In fact, it's very expensive in India, and not having the money to invest in that capacity to respond to the pressure is, I think, problematic. And we've been lucky to have sources of funding for both so far. And we'd like more on both sides.
Yes.
So we don't have donors. They're all commercial investors in those funds. And we have felt push from them, but it hasn't always been that welcome, I should say, in the sense that sometimes I feel, or often I have felt, that they need to be educated on what it is, I think related to what Jessica was saying, what it is that makes sense to be, and somehow I want to protect, I feel that I'm in the, like, gatekeeper, and I don't want to receive from the investor request for another Excel file that he or she has come up with all these. I remember receiving from one a year ago. They had copy-pasted all IRIS indicators relevant to financial inclusion, and I mean there are quite a number of them. They went to the SBTF, searched for best practices, turned them into indicators. I could recognize it. And then they sent it to me and say, we want this by the end of this quarter. And I thought, no. And I was very supported by my CEO, and I said, let us own this process. I'm not going to receive this and send it to our MFIs. I mean, I think we need to hold the companies accountable to what they say they are, what they claim they are doing. And if an MFI says that its social objective is to hire handicapped loan officers, then I will ask that MFI, how many have you been able to keep in, to hire this month, how many? But if that's not what they're saying, it's not one of their social objectives, we're not going to, I don't think it makes sense. And I have certain emotions about this because I do get frustrated. I feel we need not to burden the companies, and we need to be very rigorous within reason. What does ultimately, I think we all, everybody in this room, what we're looking for is to make performance-based investments. And what we are trying to build is the level, the knowledge, so that we can say, okay, apparently in healthcare this works, and this does not work. So we all need to work on this together, but we can't. I think there's much more knowledge sharing that needs to take place. And again, I do recommend that for us, we definitely need to be owning it wouldn't make sense to ask FINAE on some of these indicators I mentioned earlier. Listen to them. This is what they're trying to achieve. Then what makes sense to measure? And keep it to that.
So if funders aren't always helping, but we need to do more collectively, then what can we do at a higher level? Harold Rosen warned about too much system-level work, and I'm not suggesting we need that, but if we just take it one step further out, you can decide how big that step is, mid-level, high level, somewhere in between. If we're just taking one step back, what kind of work needs to happen at a system level? Now, you mentioned knowledge sharing, So, you know, I'll put you on the spot here. Would you share your data or your experiences? You know, Harold Rosen mentioned that he would be hesitant to, although he would quite like the thought of it. Would you do that?
I worked with Blue Orchard before working with Bamboo Finance, and Blue Orchard had at that point 150 MFIs in the portfolio. And I had developed a social performance scorecard, and I felt during 1 year we collected so much information. And so I told other MIVs, that microfinance investment vehicles, that had the same concern. We thought, come on, let's share this with a third party we can trust, because we did run our own regressions to see, okay, what happens with, is there a trade-off between social and financial performance, these things that we want to know, all of us want to know. And but we felt, I mean, I had an intern who was at Cambridge University doing econometrics, and I thought, okay, and he wanted to do something, so I thought, great, analyze this data for us. And he ran some regressions, and we put them on our publicly distributed report in Blue Orchard. Now, that following exercise, I mean, there were I think at least 9 MIBs who shared information. The results are coming out soon. And they were given to a third party, and that's where I think academia is key to this. I mean, it's really not our role. I studied economics, but it's been a while. I don't know how to run a regression, not anymore. So, plus, I mean, we would be biased. Of course, we would have an interest that hopefully the information results in something positive, right? But so I do think that that's where the academics, the research centers need to step in. And in this case, it was Cerise, which is based in France. It's a very well recognized social performance social performance institute, promoting social performance in MFIs, is what I'm trying to say. So they seemed to all of us ideal to be able to conduct that analysis. So let's see what they come up with.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, and I would say sharing is not just about sharing data, but sharing is also about working as a group of similar businesses to set the standards for which data we're collecting and how we want to be measured. One of the things that we've started doing recently is there are a few dozen organizations who are doing the same kind of work that we're doing, business process outsourcing, to create impact, now being called impact sourcing. And we've started a weekly call with the facilitator, and we're able to start to articulate, well, what are the standards that we want to be held to? What is the kind of data that we want to collect? How are we self-defining ourselves as a sector? And it's been enormously helpful.
Okay, interesting. And so maybe coming to you then, Margaret. I mean, in terms of looking at the slightly broader sector, how do you see the role developing for external agencies or for collaborations among organizations? Is there, for example, a space for benchmarks or a comparative data set that people can go to compare themselves to? Or?
Sure. I think probably many of you are aware the development finance institutions have been gathering over the sort of last year and a half, I guess, on development impact indicator harmonization. And the discussion has helped us all realize both the different things we gather, but also the different ways we gather the same things. And it's hard to turn any of our ships, I think, to make really quick adjustments. But we now have a forum for this information sharing and this sort of experience sharing and mechanisms we use, ways we've defined, indicators, things that will work and things that will not work. And we're trying to get to a core set of agreed sort of indicators that we'll all be looking at in our portfolio, not only just because, you know, if two of us are helping one thing and one is reporting an impact like this and one is reporting an impact like this, you'd like to see if it's, you know, maybe one institution is less effective as a money giver, or is it just because the different institutions are gathering and reporting their data differently. So I think that was the initial initiative, but what has, or the impetus, but what has come out of the relationship is it's created this network of people who deal with these challenges, practical as they mostly are, from a day-to-day basis, and how we sort of address those jointly. And we've talked about benchmarks. So, you know, we worked with Blue Orchard. We have I forget what the number is. The number, it's at least 50 MFIs that we help through one facility, one mechanism or another. Many of the DFIs are in the microfinance sector. I think the mixed market is a really interesting centralized reporting mechanism where ideally all we're doing is telling our microfinance institutions to report to the mix, and we're pulling down and doing with whatever we need for our own purposes relative to what our piece of the support was that same data. You know, you facilitate, you make the reporting easier for the MFIs, and you get to some sort of a standard that's worked externally. I don't think any of us are there yet, but it's nice to see those kinds of initiatives out there as kind of directionality, if you will, in benchmarks.
Sure. Now, I am going to open this up to the audience shortly, but before I do, I'd just like to get the views on from both Jessica and Cristina on the same kind of question, I guess. So what kind of system level initiatives or ideas do you think would work? And Cristina, I know, for example, perhaps we can start with you. I know that you've had some experience with gears, so I don't know if you have a view on what role that can play or how that fits in with enabling organizations to listen more to their investees and beneficiaries.
Sure. GEARS measures a company's performance considering the impact it has across all stakeholders. And in their assessment, there's this section called local involvement, where which is heavily weighted, by the way, and where they ask if the company routinely engages with seeking feedback from the local community about its products. So, well, yes, they have a lot to do there, and well, overall, GEARS measures or helps the companies measure impact compared to other companies and improve their impact over time.
Okay. Jessica?
Yeah. So I just want to go back actually to some of the discussion throughout the panel. One of the things I've noticed is that we talk about beneficiary feedback as if it's somehow less valid as knowledge than kind of scientifically done, externally collected survey, not so much surveys, but sort of observed data and larger scale surveys that are sort of this crossover. And I think one of the big issues and one of the things that I've found both as an academic and also working with Villgro and other agencies like that is that in a lot of cases the beneficiary feedback is incredibly valuable both for the perspective and the opening up of questions that we never thought to ask because we just don't have that life experience, and we just it never even occurred to us that that might be like a sign of gender empowerment or something like that. And second, as a source of information for the questions we are asking, because these are people who are closest to the context, who are collecting information more regularly than, say, the National Sample Survey or household level data or any of the official hard information. So you have both a quality and a perspective issue, and I think one of the things as a system is how do we take that information on a systemic level and put it on par with the hard numbers, the scientific numbers, the officially collected numbers. And one of the keys to that is obviously standardization of the language. So, something like what Iris is trying to do is unbelievably valuable just because it says, look, let's all try to at least mean the same thing when we're using these terms, which is great. I mean, that's a very important continued investment. It's also flexible because people can report different things and add and subtract. But I think also two sets of tools that have come from academia, and this is displaying my bias as a game theorist originally, that come from academia but could be very useful in applying is mechanism design for how do you get honest feedback? How do you set up systems for the way that the feedback comes in, for the ability to cross-check the feedback, two different pieces of feedback, to have in the same way that you would clean survey data to do sort of intercoder, is there sort of a coder bias or a questioner bias? The same types, those kinds of tools to be able to deal with larger scale feedback data is one set of tools that I think can come from academia that if it were made a little bit more intelligible to practitioners, there would be a significant uptake on that. I mean, there are lessons from e-governance, there are lessons from outside of necessarily just social enterprise. The second piece is really figuring out ways to use some of the new technology tools to be open to more perspectives. I mean, we can analyze much less structured data than we ever used to be able to. We don't need to have as much structure on the front end. I mean, drop down with 10 different questions. We can take free text data and analyze it more effectively. We can use flexible and ongoing, I hate to use the word ontology, but we can use flexible and ongoing things like the Twitter hashtags or the ways that people tag photos on Flickr. There are ways to have a much more participatory labeling of the data that enables it to be aggregated and analyzable in the same way as the so-called hard data. And I think that there's a whole service industry that's built up around taking randomized control trials and making it possible and feasible. It would be helpful to have a service industry that's really looking at how to apply some of the technology tools for larger and messier data. And that's something, I mean, to go back to what Harold was saying about investing in this kind of capacity in this sort of service provision industry, that would be really valuable. And I think that would be a really good use of sort of ecosystem level or ecosystem building money.
Excellent. Well, now's the opportunity for a few questions. So I don't know if anyone wants to start us off. Perhaps we'll take a couple at a time and then we can spread them out across the panel. If there is someone in particular that you would like to hear their views on, perhaps you can mention it in your question and then we can make sure. So yes, we have a couple of ladies here. Yes, let's start with.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Golden from TechnoServe. My question actually, early on you talked about feedback. For example, Villgro talked about feedback on the services you're providing. And I'm just curious from a cultural context, you work in India, and some of you work in other geographies, OPIC in 100 plus countries, how you find sort of the openness to giving feedback as you move from one country or region context to another.
Thank you. Let's take another one, please.
My name is Michelle Friedman, and I'm from the Multilateral Investment Fund, which is an autonomous fund of the Inter-American Development Bank. My question, I think some people touched on it, but it had to do with the challenges of targets, or I guess to some degree goals. And so there are benchmarking platforms out there. We have Mix, we have Research, we have even Gears. But in the case of catalytic investments in high-risk areas or in new areas, new types of investments, really spurring innovation, if you go to the funds or even the investees, they just might have no idea. You might not even know who your investees are going to be. So in this instance, do you find that you sort of, pull something out of a hat and put a target, or in some cases, are you just putting this as an indicator, a data point that we would like to collect for the future? So just how do you deal with those challenges?
Okay, well let's deal with a couple of those issues first, and then we'll come back. So let's start with the second question first. Who feels that they have a bit of experience with investments where you don't know what your indicators are going to be? No one feeling brave? Michael?
Yeah, I would say something because we've recently been having some conversations with MIF about setting targets, and it's challenging because particularly as we're looking at starting new businesses, it's really unpredictable and it's hard. We know a lot more about what kind of metrics we can have. It's really hard for us in starting new businesses and growing new businesses to be able to accurately forecast. We don't even know if they'll succeed. To be able to set a target about how fast they're going to grow is really tough. And so we appreciate that our investors need to have these targets, and we're willing to report on them. And we also, based on our experience of running these businesses, we push back in trying to create targets that we feel are reasonable and viable for us. And we'd love it if we can exceed the target, and we know our investors do as well. But we also don't want to set ourselves up for failure.
Ximena, did you have?
What I was thinking is that's not, as I listened to your question, I thought that's not relevant to us because I felt we never define targets before investing. So, what we tell investors is we invest in small and growing businesses that have a product or service that benefits low income. So already there you have an idea of what you would be looking at. even if you don't know yet, is it healthcare or education or affordable housing, right? You know how many people from low income are benefited, or what is their average revenue, how has the revenue or their income grown, for instance, over time. But defining actual targets and indicators, we only do that in the investment process around the period in which you sit down to negotiate with the company of all the financial elements, but also there you'd start thinking of what is it that we're going to be measuring in the long term. And then in some of the cases, we have built it into the shareholder agreement. There is, including in the case of FINAE, we did put a target that we wanted at least X%, I believe it's 20, to be and we meet it by far, but we wanted it to be set into the shareholder agreement. Or at times we have negotiated a put option if we feel this company that we invested in because it was going to develop a low-income insurance product for low-income employees, suddenly feels that it's actually much more profitable to target higher income people, and then suddenly deviates there. We actually wrote a put option in that shareholder agreement saying if you deviate, we're out. So it's hard to respond in the sense that I don't think it would make sense to define targets before you invest. Unless they're really very high level, like...
I guess also, I mean, involved in this conversation around feedback, a lot of the data you're looking for is perspective feedback and perspective data, which can be applied to various situations. So it's not so much specific to the one organization. So if you're looking for feedback about your due diligence process, maybe that's something that could be, you would know your targets in advance of. I'm asking, I'm not telling. That's all. Okay, so let's move to the first question there, and about culture, Jessica.
I think Villgro is still very small, so we have a personal relationship with everybody. Politeness. I have, anecdotally found that companies with foreign and Indian management teams are much more vocal, and that could be a reflection of me and who I am. I'm the only American currently working at Villgro, and so it could be just some kind of small n kind of familiarity, but I think that the personal relationship is extremely valuable, and it's one of the things that this panel has gotten me thinking is how do we scale up what's working quite well for us because we're so small.
Margaret, yeah.
Yeah, to answer this question, I go a little bit away from the pure impact data collection. We care a lot about labor worker rights issues. And when we monitor in the field, we actually do interviews with employees of the companies that we're supporting. We pull them sort of away from management. And the folks we have who do that are quite attuned to the different ways that you need to do that in different environments. And they usually joke about the countries where you don't even have to, you just say, I'm looking for feedback, and everyone's me, and they're all coming. And the places where you really have to work very, very hard to go make sure you get someone in an environment where they feel comfortable that they can respond, make sure you're getting the right kind of people who can get you the responses that you need. So I think we face this quite a lot when we're doing field interviews around worker rights issues, making sure there's no child labor in agriculture, for example. It's very culture specific.
Great, thank you. So, yes, we'll take this gentleman here, and then after this, the young lady in front of her.
Hello, I'm Samir Doshi from Cambridge University. My question was kind of touching upon Jessica's last point before the Q&A session, in terms of trying to value the knowledge and the input that you're getting from beneficiaries or community members. I was wondering if anyone's explored or is currently doing, in terms of reporting to those same populations, right? Rather than just your investors or the funders, that if you're trying to have a reciprocal relationships, right? So you're obtaining information from these communities, what are you kind of giving back to them? And if you are, have you thought about translating it into languages that, these other types of barriers?
Excellent, thank you. And yeah.
It's quite a similar point, actually. We find that when we're trying to get beneficiary feedback, the gatekeepers are the businesses we work with, obviously, and then they can tell us about their employees or their clients or whatever. And at Endeavour, like in the field, we have surveys that come to us from Global, which are really well designed, and then we almost have to package them in a way that makes the businesses want to respond to them. So for example, we have an employee survey and we package it as a organizational climate survey, which will help you to improve how you work with your employees. How much of that have you guys been doing? Like, how much of that do you see that you kind of almost hide impact questions within tools that can help entrepreneurs grow?
Okay, thanks. So let's go to that first point first. So if I understood it, moving away from it being an extractive data process. So you're closing the loop, you're feeding back to your beneficiaries. Michael, perhaps with an experience with beneficiaries, maybe something you want to respond to?
So now we've been doing these surveys annually for a couple of years, and we have gotten some feedback from, particularly from our alumni who are now working in the real world, and some are quite successful. And one of the things that we hear is that they say, you always come to us to ask us how much we're earning. And well, that's what we want to know, but they feel like, well, that's the only thing that you care about with us. So we've started to look at how do we have a series of alumni events, how do we help them with their own professional networking, what are some of the things that we do to give back to that network, because that network is a network that we count on. Another thing that we've heard through this process is that our beneficiaries do not like being referred to as poor. And it's a real conundrum for us because our investors want to hear that we're making investments to benefit poor people, but they don't want to see themselves that way, and they prefer not to be referred to that way. And so it's interesting that we're starting to get those feedback loops as we report back. And one of the things that we realize in a global world is every time we put a report up on our website, every time we refresh our website with new information about our social impact, beneficiaries see it. We've trained them in technology, and they get back to us and they say, "Why are you saying that about us?" So it's quite interesting that we're in a new world of transparency, and that the reporting back that we do in one place is visible and transparent to the people who are helping.
Cristina, you've been nodding your head.
Yeah, I completely agree with Michael. I think one of the yes, you cannot always just report back. Maybe one of the best ways to do it is just changing what they are asking for. So in this case, what we did was change the complete scheme of our product and then offer that to them. And beneficiaries are quite happy with that, and they feel that they are listened to, which is very important. And once again, though we report to our investors' socioeconomic level, gender, and those metrics, we cannot come back and tell them how many low-income people we're reaching. Not exactly because, yes, they don't like to be called like that. Though we finance not only low-income, but like the whole pyramid, though we are concentrated in the VOP sector.
Okay, then going to that second question. Margaret or Jessica? Margaret, perhaps you can, so hiding these impact questions within the survey.
So we haven't done any employee surveys like this, and I know if we try, we would face a lot of pushback from our clients about asking even more questions, but we do ask when we're in the field. We do ask questions of, people like the person that they've asked to drive you off to one of the sites. Very interesting insight. you might think about who drives your donors to visit your sites because that's a great way to get really sort of ground level information on what people really think about what's going on. Taxi drivers, fantastic. Taxi drivers. But I think getting the information back to the client, you talked about in the way that they can understand it. When we do our site interviews and we go through the data that they've been providing in our annual questionnaire, and we explain the questions better and then tell them what we do with the information, we almost always get this, oh, and the following year's submission is much higher quality. the problem is we don't have the resources to do that with absolutely everyone. We tried webinars, and people are afraid of them, I think. Some people would open them, a lot of people wouldn't open them, so we've tried as much as we could. How can we get to all of these clients in their very different locations? Because when we are able to have this client-specific interaction about what we're doing, why we're asking the question the way we're asking, and what we do with the information when we get it, we get much better responses.
Okay, so I think we've got time for another couple of quick questions. We have one here down the front, and gentleman at the back there, yeah. So perhaps we can start. Very front row, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Paula Hurtado from Algo en Común. It's a rating agency for development projects, and from Mexico. So I would like to open the question of how to overcome scalability when the technology is not the option. And I would put like an example that I right now struggling is I am evaluating in Yucatan a farmers. So I need to go with the ending beneficiaries that are indigenous people, and they only not have access to internet. Also, I need a translator because they speak Mayan. I mean, this is one of the main problems, that because we are solving developing problems, there is no access to internet. So to gain scalability is a question that I would like to open in the panel.
Thank you. And yes, it was a gentleman at the back row. Sorry, I'm making you walk a lot.
Hi, just a quick question. How do you answer the question, or how do you know if you and your organizations that you work for are any good? And how do you know if the organizations that you invest in are any good? And how do you differentiate between the two?
How do we know if they are good? Is that
We're not. They're good or we're good.
How do you differentiate, if I understood, how do you differentiate between evaluating your own performance and evaluating that of your investees? Is that correct? So let's start with that. So we don't have huge amounts of time left. And we could probably spend the next 2 days talking about that, but who would like to give
I think the best response is probably yours, Kai, because you're
Right,
probably
you have the
familiar
ledge.
with what investees think, right?
Correct.
And
Yeah.
I think that I would really recommend to start, I mean, for us it was really useful to read their report, which they went out to ask investees what they think about us. And I actually distributed in our team, and I said, listen, we didn't participate, but read the responses. And I don't know if we would do any better than the average there. And I think for me, ultimately, that's the constituency that I care the most. I wish that we really add value to those companies. And if we don't, we really have a problem. But I'm sorry, I wasn't going to propose a response, but rather a kind of.
Well, there is a session tomorrow on investee voice, a workshop. So if you're interested, perhaps that's one for you. But just very quickly, one of the main findings from this report, which we did, was that investees don't know their impact with their beneficiaries. And therefore, if you take that a level back, it's very hard for you to know your impact through your investees. I'm sure some do.